Welcome back to educator.com. In today's lesson, we're going to go over elections and campaigns. So let's get right down to the material. So today's lesson overview, we're going to discuss different types of political participation. What are ways that you can get involved in the political process? We're going to review the amendments and laws that have increased suffrage, which is the right to vote in this country. We're going to examine reasons why the United States has relatively low voter turnout. And again, one reason that you might want to put, this might be like an FRQ question. If you put apathy, that simply isn't enough. So what are concrete things? So what has contributed towards apathy? If you think about it, low voter turnout, that's kind of a reason, the reason why. It's not really the reason why. It's more symptomatic of apathy. So explain apathy, or explain the reasons why Americans generally don't vote. So to say apathy wouldn't be considered correct as far as the AP is concerned. We're going to determine the highest correlating factors to voting, similar to correlating factors that makes one a Republican or Democrat. What factors is going to cause an individual to vote rather than not vote? We're going to evaluate different types of primary systems that states employ. And finally, we're going to differentiate between presidential elections and off-year elections. So, forms of political participation. A couple years back, one of the free response questions were, name two different ways, aside from voting, that individuals can participate in the political process. Again, I don't know about you, but questions like these, they're difficult because they're not that difficult, if you can kind of catch my drift. It's one of those things where some of it's kind of common sense, that when you're trying to learn about the government, it's hard to really pinpoint certain things. So it may be difficult because you didn't spend time studying forms of political participation, and it's hard to verbalize it. So it's one of those tricky things where it really should be an easy question, but sometimes people will overcomplicate the answer. So obviously voting is the primary way most individuals will actually get involved in the political process, but that's not the only way. Simply discussing politics and attending political meetings. This is one way that you can increase political participation. You can actually just attend some of these things. You can form interest groups and PACs. So we're going to talk about PACs and super PACs in the next lecture, but not only can you vote and actually attend these meetings, you can you can decide, I want to create a PAC that tries to help young Republicans or young Democrats. You can set up a PAC. Now, the problem with this is that most individuals don't have the time, money, or inclination to do any of these things, but that certainly is one way you can get involved in the political process. One thing, you can contact public officials. If there's an issue that you're concerned about, you can call your congressman, you can write a letter to your congressman, you can do several things that participate in the system. And trust me, you have politicians that want your vote, so they're going to do their best to accommodate you to the best of their ability. Personal story, when I was in Washington, D.C., I was able to contact my congressman, Ed Royce, and I actually used to intern for Ed Royce when I was when I was a senior in college. And so he personally didn't remember me, but because he associated me as a former intern, he was very kind and took me actually on a special tour of the Capitol. There's a special members-only tram that takes you to the floor of the House. At that time, then Minority Leader John Boehner was speaking on the floor of the House. So even contacting your congressman, that's a form of political participation. And I was able to talk politics with him. Kind of a unique opportunity that if you have a chance to visit Washington, D.C., one of the things that you can do is you can talk to your representative. Also, campaigning for a candidate or political party. I've done that before, volunteered for a local state election, and you take a list of registered voters and you go and you knock on doors and you talk to people. One person I met said that he was a convicted felon, and so maybe I shouldn't waste his time because he wasn't registered to vote. But you know what? Being a convicted felon, actually, in some states, depending on the state that you're living in, it does not preclude you from actually voting. What's kind of interesting in the state of California, in the gubernatorial race, there's a Republican candidate who's actually a convicted rapist or attempted rapist, sex offender, and convicted of manslaughter. So he killed someone in an accident. He's actually running for governor, and there's no law that prevents individuals from running for office, even if he or she is a convicted felon. So it's kind of one of those things in our Constitution that you would think that certain forms of political participation shouldn't be allowed if you committed this crime or that crime. But again, there's no law against that, and people are free to participate in the political process in a lot of different ways. It's just most people just tend to vote in elections, and a lot of people don't even do that, right? One easy way of doing that is to contribute money to a candidate or political party. I haven't done a whole lot, but there's 2 candidates that I have contributed money to. So if there's a candidate that you are passionate about, you can give a check up to individuals. Again, depending on the year, but you can give X amount of money to candidate per election cycle. That's one way you can contribute. And one thing, again, that I mentioned before, you can run for office. And doesn't matter if you're if you think, oh, I don't have enough experience, you are eligible to run for office, at least for Congress, if you're at least 25 years old, lived 7 years in the United States, and you are a resident of the state. Senate, 30 years old, 9 years a resident, and you are a resident of the state. And President of the United States, you're 35 years old, you live 14 years in the United States, and you're a natural-born citizen. So anyone can basically run for office. It's just one of those things that most people don't do simply because they're not interested, or time considerations. Or you can protest government decisions. I think a lot of people will resort to that. If they don't like something, they'll congregate and they'll protest, and it's definitely within an individual's First Amendment rights to participate that way. Expansion of suffrage. So what is suffrage? Suffrage is the right to vote. Okay. So if you take a look at, originally the issue of suffrage was left to the states. So it's not that women were prevented from voting. It's just that the Constitution was silent about women voting, for example. So women, the decision on whether or not they are allowed to vote, that was left up to the states. And Wyoming was the first state in 1869 that granted women suffrage. Now, others, in terms of, blacks, were they allowed to vote? Well, technically they were, but a lot of states denied slaves from voting. And it wasn't until the 15th Amendment that allowed basically blacks to vote. 17th Amendment basically allowed for voting to take place for Senate elections. The 19th Amendment guaranteed women the right to vote. The 23rd Amendment allowed residents of Washington, D.C. to vote. Now, they don't have congressional representation, but now they can vote in presidential elections. And the 24th Amendment prohibited poll taxes for federal elections. And the 26th Amendment allowed 18-year-olds to vote. So these all deal with expanded voting rights for the population. So the 15th, 17th, 19th, 23rd, 24th, and 26th. So a lot of these amendments, so out of the 17 amendments that were adopted after the Bill of Rights, you had pretty much 6 of them, 6 of the 17 deal with the expansion of suffrage. So the issue of voting is a central part of American democracy, and rightly so. Now, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, whereas the 15th Amendment granted blacks the right to vote, in practice, there are a lot of things that were going on in the South, particularly, that prevented blacks from voting. For example, there are a lot of different things, but basically the Voting Rights of 1965, Voting Rights Act of 1965, it prohibits discrimination in voting, and it was basically designed to enforce the 15th Amendment rights. Now, in an ideal world, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 probably was unnecessary if the states were following through with exactly what the spirit of the 15th Amendment was all about. But again, certain states, rather than disallowing blacks to vote, they would come up with certain requirements, such as a literacy test, or was your grandfather a voter? Grandfather. If your grandfather wasn't, then you weren't allowed to. So there are all these stipulations with the end goal of having blacks not voting. And the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was the major reason why you saw an increase in political participation among blacks, particularly in the South. Again, passage of the act was the main reason why voting participation increased among blacks in the late 1960s and 1970s. So if you see a multiple choice question, which of the following was the principal reason that accounted for the increase of political participation among blacks? The correct answer is not the Civil Rights Act of 1964, but the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Because civil rights and voting rights, again, some go hand in hand, but these are two separate issues. Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964. The Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965. Now, low voter turnout. So why don't people vote? That's a very legitimate question. So the expansion of the electorate, the 26th Amendment, that could be one reason. Meaning, young people in particular, they're not in the habit of voting, so they don't. So it's a matter of people are creatures of habit. So if you've never voted before, then it's hard to do something new. That's why, especially when you expand the electorate from 21 and over to 18 and over, a lot of the population that could vote, they're seniors in high school and freshmen in college, and a lot of things are going on in their lives, and registering to vote or voting in elections probably isn't one of the things that rate as one of their top priorities. So there's actually some folks out there that advocate for actually reducing the minimum age to 16 when individuals are probably in high school and more likely in a place where they're not as transient as a first-year college student. Probably won't gain a whole lot of momentum. Now, states could lower the voting age to 16, but to my knowledge, no state has actually done that. Okay, so the question is, should we lower the voting age to 16? Honestly, this would serve to benefit the Republican Party. Young people tend to vote Democrat, so if that came up, it might not be framed as a partisan issue, but you can probably bet that there would be some Republican opposition to that type of bill. Another reason why people don't vote: simple mistrust of government and lack of perceived differences between candidates. So after the Watergate scandal, people have lost their trust in government officials. So, with all the scandals and corruption that these government officials are part of, some people are like, what, things are okay, and whoever's in office, it doesn't matter anyway. So a lot of people feel that way, and as a result, actually public confidence has gone down of public officials. If you look at approval ratings, congressional approval ratings, sometimes hover in the single digits, which is kind of interesting because you have a huge favorable rating for your particular congressman, but the approval rating for Congress as an institution, again, might be like 8 or 7%. And again, perception that all politicians are the same. So, Democrat, Republican, they're all the same. So sometimes people have that attitude. There are differences in candidates. And lack of political efficacy. So maybe there are differences, but it's the belief that one vote will not make the difference. So, why should I vote? That one vote is not going to count. So you have a lot of that type of attitude maybe permeating the electorate. And then finally, it's the idea that there's difficulty of registration process. Now, one way that Congress has tried to correct the barriers to voting is what's known as the National Voter Registration Act of 1995, or the Motor Voter Law, which allowed registration at the DMV. So the DMV is a place that a lot of individuals go anyway, so they basically made it a little simpler process to try to register to vote. These are different reasons why individuals don't vote. Doesn't mean that some elections will be more popular than others, but as a whole, you can make the argument that of all the electorate that could be registered to vote, only about half of them are actually registered to vote. And of those that are registered to vote, half or even less than half will actually vote. So basically deciding the presidency of the United States, again, assuming a majority, which technically you don't have to have, is you only have to have half of the population voting for you. That's only 1/8 the amount of votes required, if it's the case that only half are registered and half vote. Again, some elections tend to be more popular, but that's kind of interesting thing. We're living in a democracy republic, and where you don't have political participation, you don't get an accurate sense of what the people want. So who votes? So what are the characteristics that are most correlated to voting? It has to do with education, age, gender, religion, marital status, union or community membership, and geography. So who's more likely to vote? The higher the level of education, the more likely he or she will vote. This is the most important indicator of voting behavior, okay, on whether or not you do vote or you don't vote. I mean, it makes a whole lot of sense. If you're struggling, you dropped out of high school and you're struggling to make ends meet, again, going to the elections on the first Tuesday of February or first Tuesday of November is probably not the number one priority for you. Whereas, especially maybe if you graduated college, if you're a government major, if you have a PhD, then you're going to see voting as more of being your civic duty. So chances are, if you graduate high school, you're more likely to vote than a high school dropout. A college graduate is more likely to vote than just a high school graduate, and so on and so forth. And again, it makes sense on an intuitive level. Senior citizens, they vote while teenagers do not. Those that have a lot of age experience, voting becomes more of a priority. Whereas younger folks, they don't vote as much. And recently, younger folks have voted more as Democrats. But initially, when the 26th Amendment was passed, there was very little perceptible difference in how young people voted as compared to the rest of the population. Again, today, young people will vote Democrat, but originally that wasn't the case. Gender, okay, women vote more than men vote. So you can argue women are more responsible than men as a whole in terms of civic duty. So not only is there a gender gap, meaning women tend to be more Democrat than they do Republican, but women vote more than men. And that's just a huge advantage to the Democrat Party. So a lot of these politicians are trying to cater to their female base for obvious reasons. Religion. So actively involved religious individuals vote more often than their non-involved counterparts. And it makes sense. Maybe if you belong to a particular religion, you're going to have more stake in what goes on in society. And so you will tend to express your your right to participate politically than non-religious counterparts. Again, not necessarily the case all the time, but as a general rule of thumb. Again, marital status, same idea. Married people vote more so than singles. Maybe married people care more about what happens to society than someone that's single. And so that's a factor. Union or community membership. So they're more likely to vote than non-union or isolated folks. So again, people surrounded by community with like-minded individuals, they're more likely to vote than someone who's not a union member and isolated from society. And then geography. States that do not have one-party domination will generally see more participation. In 1980, Jimmy Carter's 1980 early concession speech actually angered a lot of Democrat leaders in California because he conceded the election prior to the polls closing in California. And what a lot of California Democrat leaders, they argued that it was not good for them because a lot of people would see that, Carter lost the election, so why go vote anyways when a lot of other local elections were at stake. So as a rule of thumb, presidential candidates, they tend not to concede the election until voting has closed in all the states. Again, as a rule of thumb, there's no constitutional requirement for that to take place. Type of elections. This is very important here. Primary elections, basically, these are nominating elections in which candidates within a party, so it's an intra-squad matchup, they choose a person to run in the general election, which is more of a inter-squad, of a intercollegiate as opposed to intracollegiate. So within the party is the primary election, and the general election is you're fighting against, if you're a Republican, then against a Democrat. But in a primary, it's Republican versus Republican, Democrat versus Democrat. And there's 4 different types of primaries. You have the closed primary, the open primary, the blanket primary, and then the top 2 primary. This is actually more of a recent phenomenon, but I'll go ahead and explain that. The closed primary is very simple. It's only voters registered within the party are permitted to vote. So if you're a Republican, then you are permitted to vote in the Republican primary. If you're a Democrat, then you can vote in the Democrat primary. So in 2012, if you were a Democrat, then it probably wasn't very exciting for you to vote for the presidential candidate in the primary race because Obama was essentially unopposed for the presidential nomination. So theoretically, if you really want to sabotage your opponent, theoretically you could re-register as a Republican, and you could have voted in who you thought would have been the weaker candidate. Now I'm pretty sure there might have been individuals that have done this. There's nothing inherently illegal. Maybe some might refer to this being unethical, but I'm sure a lot of people have either considered or have actually executed. Now, whether it actually makes a perceptible difference, that's a different issue. But closed primaries, again, it's only for those that belong to one political party. They vote in that election. Open primaries, voters of either party may participate. So open primaries, you can actually see probably some effect where if you're a Democrat, then you can decide, I want to vote for the Republican primary. And you can see how this could be an issue in 2012 when the Democrats basically had their nomination pretty much wrapped up in Obama. And so this is one way that a member of an opposing party can kind of jump into the fray. Okay. In a blanket primary, so for example, Alaska and Washington, voters can vote for different party candidates for different offices. So you can kind of choose. So you can vote for Republicans for the Senate race and Democrats in the House race. So that's one way you can kind of choose which slate of candidates per office. Now, in California, there's a top 2 primary system. So California, again, this might be interesting if other states follow, but the top 2 candidates So regardless of party, advance to the general election, which serves to diminish the role of political parties in the primary process. So you could have the case where you have 5 Democrats and no Republicans duke it out in the primary, and whoever has the top 2 votes, they advance to the general election. So you could have a Democrat between a Democrat, Republican, and Republican. What that does is that the idea behind that was to make it such that primary elections wasn't about to catering the base, but to having more moderate candidates within the political party. But one of the obvious things, maybe disadvantages, is that come general election time, you lose the voice of that second party, and also third parties. They're not even participating because now it's the top 2. So obviously there are some benefits to having a top 2 primary system, but there are flaws. One major flaw is that you no longer have the voice of the other party in the general election. So you're left with possibly Republicans having to vote between 2 Democrats, which they might not want to do. And similarly, you might have a Democrat wanting to vote for a Democrat, but is forced to basically choose between 2 Republicans. And not in all elections is that going to take place, but that's certainly possible. And you have third-party candidates. Their role is completely, shut out in general elections. Now they basically have to pour their resources in a primary election, and less people vote in primary elections than they do in general elections. So again, that's one of the reforms that California has made, partly to reform the election process, but one of the byproducts has been the lessened effect of political parties in the voting system. So presidential elections, what are they? Well, they're held every 4 years, for example, 2012, 2016, 2020, whereas off-year elections refer to congressional elections held in between the presidential elections, 2014, 2018, and 2022. Now, again, I think for obvious reasons, voter turnout is higher for presidential elections than midterm elections. People like voting, saying, I voted for Barack Obama, or I voted for Mitt Romney. Not as many people get excited about these midterms. And in the United States, we have so many different elections. Sometimes we have just local elections, off-year elections, off-year primaries, presidential elections. And so, there might be election fatigue that takes place. And that could be one reason why people don't vote as much, because compared to some other countries, we have a lot more elections to keep track of. But again, for obvious reasons, people are going to vote more in presidential elections than midterms or off-year elections. So in the incumbent president's midterm election, again, it's not uncommon. It's common for the political party of the president to lose seats. For example, in 2006, it was not a good year for George W. Bush. Okay, the Democrats took control of the House, which was George W. Bush's 6th year in office. Usually, again, the midterm of the second year of the president's, or second term of the president's office, the 6th year, usually is not too favorable to the president. Now, in 2010, the Republicans took back control of the House, and again, this was the midterm election for Obama's first term. And again, it should be interesting in 2014, what are the results that are going to take place in Obama's 6th year? Is it going to be as noticeable of a change that happened in 2006 when George Bush lost a lot of seats and lost control of the House of Representatives? It should be interesting to see. But again, there is a pattern to this in terms of how elections play out. Now, the road to the White House. So the most significant election is the election for president. Again, it happens every 4 years. And there are a lot of things that go on with that, a lot of informal and some formal things. The informal thing is probably the exploration, and then the eventual announcement, and then it's the presidential primaries and caucus. So the exploration, there's a lot of things, informal things that go on. You try to fish out whether or not so-and-so candidate is running, and if he is, then you back off. If he isn't, then you try to increase support. One individual that hasn't announced that he's going to run for president in 2016, but all indications look like he is Republican Rand Paul. Rand Paul is a son of Ron Paul, and Ron Paul unsuccessfully ran in the Republican primaries in 2008 and 2012. Well, Rand Paul, he's done a lot of exploration. So, in that stage, what does the candidate do? So the candidate determines whether he or she has enough support by forming an exploratory committee, raising funds, and getting media attention. And the big thing really is getting that media attention. Rand Paul actually made the headlines recently. Out of the potential presidential candidates, he actually ranked at top. It was only something like 16%. As the preference for eligible Republicans. Now again, that when it's 16% and your opponent has maybe 15 or 14, that's not necessarily a very commanding lead, but it showed that someone like Rand Paul has the possibilities. And if you are wanting to make a case to be president, then a lot of it is trying to get your name out and doing a lot of things in the media to get people used to the idea that you might be the president of the United States. So you do a lot of informal things, and you fish out whether your candidacy has any viability. And Rand Paul was very vocal in his in his critique in how Hillary Clinton was handling her job as Secretary of State. And in questioning her, because in his role as a senator of Kentucky, he basically informally announced that he would run for president by saying, "If I were president, I would have relieved you of your duty," in response to how she handled a particular situation. So that's basically what is taking place. Okay, so the announcement is a formal declaration of candidacy. Obama announced his candidacy in February 2007 at the old state capitol in Illinois, where Abraham Lincoln began his political career. So, sometime maybe like a year and a half before the election. So maybe in the election of 2020, so-and-so announces his or her candidacy in January of 2019 or June of 2019. Usually a good year and a half, anywhere between maybe 16 to 20 months leading up to the general election, because there's a long grueling primary schedule that a president has to endure. Okay, so again, once you make the announcement, you go through these nominating contests that starts in Iowa. And that's a big state for both parties. Obama in 2008, he won in a very close race between him, John Edwards, and Hillary Clinton, but that gave him a lot of credibility, and a lot of other states, maybe they may have been hesitant to vote for Obama, but when he won, I think a lot of individuals in different states that may have preferred Hillary or preferred Obama, but thought Hillary as being the safe choice. With Obama winning Iowa, it gave him the push that he needed really to get his campaign started. And George H.W. Bush in 1980, he ended up losing the nomination to Ronald Reagan, but he got the big mo. So he won that election, and ultimately his support was large enough that Reagan actually gave him the vice presidency. Again, most states, they use the presidential preference primary rather than the caucus system to determine whom the state delegates will support at the National Party convention. So another big part to becoming president of the United States. So once you've gone through all these grueling primaries, if you somehow you survive, then you make it to the nominating convention. And what takes place? Well, a convention takes place in the summer prior to the general election. So in 2012, Republicans held their convention in Tampa, Florida, and Democrats, they had it in Charlotte, North Carolina. So you want to have in a state generally that it matters to have. Again, if it's in the swing states, then all the better to try to build momentum for your political party by having it in a key swing state. Again, in terms of differences between the Republicans and Democrats, Republicans generally have this winner-take-all model, whereas Democrats employ more of a proportional system. So if you have two candidates remaining in both parties, chances are the Republican candidate is going to have it wrapped up well before the Democrat candidate, because if a Republican wins, and let's say there's 100 delegates, in a lot of the cases, the Republican is going to win 100 delegates. Whereas Democrats, it might be only 60 to 40. It's more of a proportional method. So it's easier for a Democrat candidate running for president to hang in there, right? And to take a look at how Republicans and Democrats have a varied system in nominating the president. In 2008 and 2012, John McCain and Mitt Romney, respectively, they secured the nomination fairly early on. In 2008, actually, Mitt Romney lost New Hampshire, and New Hampshire was, the state that went right after Iowa. And based on losing that, I think he realized the math behind what it would take to actually win the nomination, and he shortly thereafter, partly to preserve his place in line so that he could run for president in 2012, which ended up happening, he bowed out of the race fairly quickly. Same thing in 2008, or in 2000, John McCain was running for president to be the Republican nominee. He stayed in there a fairly long time, but then again he bowed out, partly again to save his place in line, which he was able to do in 2008 to be the Republican nominee. So again, there's this tendency for Republicans to kind of accept this idea that if you lose the presidential primary process, then you stay loyal and you'll be rewarded for running again later. At least that's what happened with Mitt Romney, John McCain, and even someone like you have other candidates like Bob Dole was kind of a retread when he ran in 1996, but he also ran in 1976 as Gerald Ford's vice presidential candidate. So Republicans tend to favor the established candidate who has run before. Whereas Democrats, they tend to embrace more of the newer candidate, and that's exactly what Obama represented. In 2008, Hillary Clinton stayed much longer, again, because of the proportional system, because of possible support from the superdelegates, of which Bill Clinton was one. So kind of one of the things that the Democrats have a lot more of than the Republicans is that they have these pledged superdelegates, it's an unofficial term, but these delegates that basically can put a vote in for a candidate, and usually they're prominent members of the party. So Bill Clinton in 2008, conceivably, Bill Clinton, and if he was able to convince all of the superdelegates to vote in favor of Hillary instead of Obama, even though Obama, through election, might have won a majority of the delegates, it could have been the case where the superdelegates could have made it such that Hillary was the nominee. Practically speaking, it probably wouldn't have happened, just maybe because of the public outroar. But again, the system of selecting the candidate for president for the Democrats is such that it is possible for that to take place, because the rules are slightly different than what the Republicans employ. So running to the center, what the heck does that mean? Okay, running to the center, campaigning and the general election. So once you've made it to nominating convention, then the strategy is going to shift. Usually, candidates, when they run to the center, they generally run to the center after the primary contests have ended because they want to cater to the moderates here. So again, in both 2008 and 2012, John McCain and Mitt Romney, they appealed to conservatives, and then they won their respective nominations. And John McCain was very harsh on immigration, and Mitt Romney was very pro-life in 2008 and 2012 respectively. And then once they win the nomination, then you don't see them talk about that issue as much. So it's kind of a game that politicians play in both parties. Basically, they appeal to the conservatives or the liberals if you're a Democrat, and then once you secure the nomination, you try to get the moderates to vote. Again, that's been the strategy that a lot of candidates have employed. So again, they've attempted to cater more to moderates in the general election. Now, how did they do that? Well, 1960 was the first televised presidential debate. And again, ever since 1976, it's expected that candidates will appear in a series of presidential debates, of which in 1992, independent Ross Perot was included because he surpassed the 15% threshold required to participate. So again, our election system, you're not required per se to debate, but it would go against precedent not to debate. Richard Nixon didn't want to debate in 1968 and 1972. In 1964, Lyndon Johnson saw no benefit in having a debate. So the first kind of more the presidential debate in 1960 was kind of a first, and then it was suspended for 16 years until you had Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter debating in the 1976 presidential election. So choosing a VP candidate, that's another huge thing that the candidates will use as a way to appeal to the broader electorate as a whole, and sometimes maybe to secure their base as well. Again, candidates will use varying strategies to balance the ticket. So balancing the ticket, again, it refers to presidential candidates' attempt to choose a VP candidate that will bring more votes to the party, or again, to balance out his weaknesses, or at least perceived weaknesses. So in 1960, John F. Kennedy from Massachusetts, he chose Lyndon Johnson from Texas. So that was a geographic balancing the ticket, along with the experience, okay? So again, in part to balance the ticket geographically, as well as to bring in a more experienced politician. So you had a Southern Democrat who was a fixture in the Senate, and then you had a young Republican or young Eastern Democrat who, again, didn't have as much or as nearly as much experience as LBJ. In 1992, Bill Clinton, on the other hand, he didn't really balance the ticket in the traditional way. Bill Clinton chose Al Gore, who was another young Southern male, and so his way of balancing the ticket was maybe re-emphasizing his strengths and accentuating the differences between him and then President George Bush, who was a little bit older. Okay. In 2008, moderate Mitt Romney chose a conservative Sarah Palin, while young Obama chose a more experienced Joe Biden. So sometimes if you are, if you want to brandish your conservative credentials, if you're perceived moderate, you're going to try to pick a conservative. Similarly, if you're a younger individual, then you're going to want to fortify your credentials as an experienced team. So actually, what's kind of interesting here is it wasn't Mitt Romney actually. So the candidate actually that was chosen in 2008, the nominee was John McCain, not Mitt Romney. So John McCain was the one that chose Sarah Palin. Now in 2012, Mitt Romney was the nominee, Republican nominee. So Mitt Romney, he appeased the conservatives with the selection of Congressman Paul Ryan. So both John McCain and Mitt Romney, they didn't really get the enthusiasm from the conservatives. So in order to balance their ticket, they felt the need to reach out and get someone that was more conservative than they were. In 2000, George Bush didn't feel that need as much, but rather he wanted to balance the ticket a little bit more by bringing someone that may have had a little bit more heft in political experience, and that was Dick Cheney. Now, interesting story about Dick Cheney was that Dick Cheney was selected by George Bush to find a vice presidential candidate for him. So originally, Dick Cheney was brought in to be the team that found the vice presidential candidate. And lo and behold, Dick Cheney searched the entire country from California to New York to try to find a suitable vice presidential candidate. And he reported to George Bush, there was no one. So why don't I become your vice presidential nominee? And that's how it happened. I'm sure there's a lot of details in there that's missing, but there's a lot of factors that go into the selection of a vice president. And really the only person that would have an intimate knowledge of what actually happens and all of the factors and considerations is the presidential candidate himself. So the Electoral College. So you go through the election, and again, you want to try to win this election. You want to get a majority in the Electoral College. Each state has a number of electors equal to its senators and House members in Congress. Washington, D.C., under the 23rd Amendment, they have 3 electors. Again, no congressional representation, but they get 3 votes in the Electoral College. So there's a total of 538 electors, which is 535. So technically, actually, 435 House members, plus 100 senators, plus 3 D.C. electors. And they're the ones that vote for the President of the United States. So people don't vote for the President of the United States. They vote for electors who are pledged delegates to vote in the Electoral College. Again, this is a very unique system that's not really replicated anywhere around the world. But again, the reason why we have that is the founding fathers, they didn't trust the people. So this is one of the informal things that we've adapted as a country, that even though the people don't directly vote for the president, it's pretty much understood that people do individually make their preference known, and the delegates are supposed to reflect the wishes of those that vote them in as a delegate. Okay, but as we all know, if there's a loophole, then people are going to take it. So there are cases of faithless electors who do not vote according to what they are supposed to do. For example, in 2000, George Bush won by a count of 271 to 263. Now let's do some math right here. So George Bush, he won 270 votes. And Al Gore won 260, actually not 271, I'm sorry. So George Bush won 271. Al Gore won 266. Let's do a little bit of math right here. I know this is not math class, it's not calculus, but good to know a little government math here. 1 plus 6 equals 7. 7 plus 6 equals 3. Carry the 1. And you have 537. So where did that 1 vote go? So 537 votes. And that 1 vote was the faithless elector from Washington, D.C., a woman by the name of Barbara Lett Simmons. She abstained to protest D.C.'s lack of congressional representation. So the count should have been 271 to 267. Now, again, that vote didn't end up mattering, but imagine if there were 2 electors, that felt the same way and they abstained from voting, you would have had a constitutional nightmare for some. Now, it would have been a pretty exciting constitutional nightmare, but if it were the case that George W. Bush won 269 votes and Al Gore won 267 votes, if that were the case, then George Bush does not have a majority. So the President of the United States is determined by the House as stipulated under the Constitution. If there is no majority, then the election now goes to the House of Representatives. Each state acts as one vote, and the candidate with the majority of the electoral college votes, so that would be 26 states, then that individual who has gotten the majority is now the president, and the Senate vice presidents, the Senate gets to decide who is the vice president. So that would have been interesting. What if we had George Bush as president and Joseph Lieberman as the vice president, or conversely, Al Gore as president and you had a vice president, Dick Cheney? That would have made for some interesting politics. But fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on your perspective, that didn't happen. So again, this poses a problem in our system because we can have these faithless electors and they can influence the outcome of the election. Okay, so example number 1. Which amendment to the Constitution granted voting rights to 18-year-olds? Okay, is it the 18th Amendment? It's not the 18th Amendment because that deals with prohibition. Okay, so this is incorrect. 19th Amendment has to do with women's suffrage. So that is incorrect as well. 23rd Amendment has to do with suffrage, but it has to do with DC suffrage. This is the Michael Jordan Amendment, the most famous number 23 to move to Washington, D.C. And so that wasn't it. 24th Amendment has to do with elimination of the poll tax. So it did expand suffrage, but the answer is E, none of the above, because it is the 26th Amendment that granted voting rights to the American public that are 18 years old and over. Okay, example number 2. What type of primary only permits registered members of the party to vote in the election? And again, it's not any of the following here. It's not an open primary. That means that it doesn't matter what party registration. Blanket primaries allows you to pick and choose the different slates that you can vote for. So you can vote for Democrat in this one and a Republican in this one. Closed primary is the one that only permits party members to vote, not a runoff or a general. So it's a closed primary that permits this. Okay, example number 3. Which of the following is not a way to participate in the political process? So let's find the ways that are ways that you can participate in the political process. Voting, absolutely. You vote, you express your desire for a candidate, you are participating. Campaigning for a candidate, you are participating by favoring one candidate over another. Contributing money to a political party, absolutely. It's another form of political participation. And running for office, you can argue that is the highest form of political participation. Joining the military, very noble cause, but you are actually not participating in the political process. You can argue that you are subjecting your life to people that control the political process, but it is not really a way you participate in the political process. Okay, example number 4. Which of the following is not a reason for low voter turnout? So the answer is right there. It's the first one. It's the passage of the motor voter law. So this is actually something that the Congress passed that ended up increasing voter participation. So it's not a reason for the low voter turnout. Okay. So mistrust of the government, that's one reason that voters don't vote. Lack of political efficacy, that's another reason why people decide to stay home. No perceived difference between candidates. Again, even though you might argue there are a lot of differences, again, that reason causes a lot of people to stay home. And again, failure of political parties to mobilize voters. So again, not recruiting, not making your candidate exciting. So again, the passage of the motor voter law made it a little bit easier. It gave individuals, one easier way to register and therefore vote in the presidential elections. Okay, example number 5. What is the most important factor correlated with someone's decision whether or not to vote? Now, if the question were what factor causes an individual to vote for a particular candidate, The answer would be membership or your political party, your ideology, how you believe government should be run. But this question again is asking, what causes you to vote? What is the highest correlating factor to vote? And it has to do with education. Sure, gender is important, so is race, religion, marital status. These are all factors, but most data show that it's really the education, level of education. A college graduate, a PhD, is much more likely to vote than a high school dropout, just the way it is. And the final example is, what's the major difference? What's the major difference in the type of campaigning a candidate takes part in during the primaries versus the general election? So how is the way a candidate positions himself to the electorate different in the primary process versus the general election? Is it that Democrats will play to their conservative base and then run to the center in the general election? That is absolutely incorrect. Democrats will cater to the liberals. Republicans will pay to their liberal base and then run to the center in the general election. Again, it's the other way around, so that's not correct. Both parties will cater to the moderates in the primaries and then their bases in the general election. Again, that generally doesn't characterize elections, because in primaries, usually the extreme in both primaries are the ones that vote. And so as a Republican, you cater to the conservatives. As a Democrat, you cater to the liberals. Okay, there is no perceptible difference in campaigning patterns. There absolutely is. Okay, these politicians want votes, so they're going to emphasize different things. That's maybe the politically correct way of stating what goes on. They're going to emphasize certain things in the primaries, and then they're going to de-emphasize it and emphasize other things in the general election. So the answer is E, none of the above. So the correct way to phrase it is that the Democrats will play to their liberal bases, and Republicans will play to their conservative bases, and then they're going to run towards the center to try to get the moderates or the independents. Thank you for watching educator.com.